Hello everyone, welcome back to our Through the Bible study. If you can join me in Genesis chapter 40, we will pick up where we left off in the life of Joseph. Just to catch up real quick, Joseph was the victim of a woman scorned, and of which hell hath no fury. He has landed himself in prison. But we get a little bit of context to catch ourselves up as to why and how God was able to bless him even where he was at. If you remember at the end of the previous study that wherever Joseph was, God was able to bless him, to prosper him, and to prepare him for the plans of his life, and how God intended to use him to save and preserve life through not only his character, integrity, and making God a priority, and how he presented himself publicly, but also in his interpretation of dreams, which we'll get into here in a few verses. But first, verse 1, it says, "It came to pass after these things," which things? The prison stuff, "that the butler and the baker of the king of Egypt offended their lord, the king of Egypt." Okay, and Pharaoh was angry with his two officers. That word can also be translated eunuchs. The chief butler and the chief baker, so he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard. Now we remember when Joseph was sold to Potiphar, it notes that he was the captain of the guard. Who was Joseph slave to? The captain of the guard. Who was in charge of the prison Joseph was thrown into? The captain of the guard. And we can actually take a note to the hint and fact that in the previous chapter, when Potiphar's wife, obviously Potiphar himself being a eunuch, that was a custom. You would be castrated so that the Pharaoh wouldn't have to worry about you messing around with his harem, to put it mildly. Potiphar, essentially, the only reason he was married at all was as a trophy wife. It was just for a public reputation and appearance's sake. So you could imagine when Potiphar's wife claimed rape, Potiphar knew Joseph, Potiphar knew his wife, and was able to put two and two together, and it said his anger was aroused, but not towards Joseph. But obviously, because him being married in the first place was a public stunt, a lot of eyes were on him. So if Potiphar's wife would then go around telling people, yeah, my servant tried to rape me, but my husband played favorites with him and not me, well, that would not go well in the next issue of TMZ, if you know what I mean. So he had to throw him into prison, but did so in a way where he would be well taken care of, and in fact, given a lot more training about Egyptian culture, management, and overall just patience and trusting in God that we'll find out paid off. So the butler and the baker are both being thrown into prison, and they were put in the custody, verse 3 says, of Joseph, where he was confined, and the captain of the guard charged Joseph with them, and he served them. And so they were in custody for a while. The later note would say that he was with them for a well number of years, and it would be, in fact, 3 days rather, and then 2 years until he would be standing before Pharaoh. Now, verse 5 says, "The butler and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, had a dream," both of them. "Each man's dream in one night, and each man's dream with its own interpretation." So these dreams weren't just their week's events put on puree and set with commercials in between and advertising all the latest products. It was literally, there was a purpose for these things. There was a divine inspiration to these dreams. "And Joseph came into them in the morning and looked at them and saw that they were sad. So he asked the Pharaoh's officers who were with them in the custody of his lord's house, saying, 'Why do you look so sad today?' And they said to him, 'We each have had a dream, and there is no interpreter of it.' So Joseph said to them, 'Do not interpretations belong to God? Tell them to me, please.'" So he's giving credit where credit is due. He recognizes the difference between a skill and a gift. God gave him this ability, and he's giving proper credit to where it's due, which will also come in handy as a testament to his maintained character in the midst of being put into poor circumstances when he stands before Pharaoh. So the chief butler told his dream to Joseph. Verse 9, "He said to him, 'Behold, in my dream a vine was before me, and in the vine there were 3 branches. It was as though it had budded. Its blossoms shot forth, and its clusters brought forth ripe grapes. Then Pharaoh's cup was in my hand, and I took the grapes and pressed them into Pharaoh's cup, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand.' And Joseph said to him, 'This is the interpretation of it. The 3 branches are 3 days. Now within 3 days Pharaoh will lift up your head and restore you to your place, and you will put Pharaoh's cup in his hand according to the former manner, manner when you were his butler. So Joseph's interpretation to this man is just essentially, you'll be out of prison in 3 days and restored to your former office. But he also includes his own advice into this. Verse 14, but remember me when it is well with you. He's not just reading tarot cards at the mall or supermarket saying, hey, tips are welcome, this is free, all open to interpretation, this is just my opinion on it. No, he says, when this happens, because this came from God, please show kindness to me, make mention of me to Pharaoh, and get me out of this house. For indeed I was stolen away from the land of the Hebrews, and also I have done nothing here that they should put me into the dungeon. He's being treated well, but it's prison. It's not a place you want to stay. So all of these things happen, and we can recognize firstly that, actually we can ask ourselves a few things, but first off, with Joseph's interpretation of dreams, we see a testament to his character. With the second point being made, Joseph is putting money on the lines to saying, since these interpretations come from God, it's not some mysticism, it's literally what these things were for. But a third question needs to be asked, why did God have to speak to these men with dreams? Why couldn't he just appear to them and say, hey, don't worry about it, you'll be free in 3 days? Or at least to the butler. We'll read about the baker here in a second. But understand, it's an open question. People kind of stereotypically associate God with these cryptic messages. Who could understand the Bible? Its messages are so vague, and the only one who could ever understand it is someone with a theological seminary degree, and the only one who could really make sense out of it is the person who's actually qualified to do so. If that's your mind, then I really wonder why you're watching this video. I'm in no ways qualified to do this either. That's why I'm just reading it verbatim. Not because I'm qualified, but the Bible is clear. But it remains the question, why did God speak in such these symbolic and vague ways as through dreams that required interpretation? The answer is simple. Consider the audience. Who were the people who would be receiving these dreams? And who was there that would be readily available to provide that interpretation? Well, first off, we know Joseph was given a gift by God to interpret dreams, but also understand this was no accident, because the Egyptians were pagans, and wild ones at that. Their relationships and understanding of their pagan deities of Ra and Isis and Set and all the others, it was all centered around very powerful but aloof and distant deities. And if they ever wanted to interact with man, it was just to give them some sort of a puzzle, like you're playing God of War, and seeing if you can survive so that you can get back to the fight scenes and entertain them some more. That was the whole idea of how they understood God. And while it was a very poor recognition of the spiritual reality, God said, I can work with that. I'll give you a dream and give you the one who can interpret it. That's how God speaks to people, not in the way that he'd like to, but the place where they're at. God isn't going to force some truth on you. He's going to let you be willing to do your homework, but in the way where it's not only readily available information, which is very much plain and simple in our day and age of technology, but also noting the fact that by God meeting these people where they were at, it would set Joseph up to have greater influence in his life, just as much as give this man some encouragement as far as the future of his own. So, why did God not speak plainly? Well, first off, they wouldn't listen otherwise. They understood interaction with God, false as though it was. God met them where they were at, needed to be cryptic and vague. It's not God's preferred medium, but it's how God was able to speak to them. And Jesus, one of his most popular sayings when he was on the earth was, he who has ears to hear, let him hear. If you still can hear, use it. Because not a lot of people are even aware or willing to listen to the spiritual realities around them at all. Now, verse 16. The chief baker saw that the interpretation was good and figured, oh, feel-good sermon. Well, I want to get on this. He said to Joseph, I also was in my dream, and there were 3 white baskets on my head. And in the uppermost basket were all kinds of baked goods for Pharaoh, and the birds ate them out of the basket on my head. So Joseph answered and said, this is the interpretation of it. The 3 baskets are 3 days. Within 3 days Pharaoh will lift off your head from you and hang you on a tree, and the birds will eat your flesh from you. Now it came to pass on the 3rd day, which was Pharaoh's birthday. Oh, coincidence. that he made a feast for all of his servants. And he lifted up the head of the chief butler and of the chief baker among his servants. He called them out. And he restored the chief butler to his butlership again, and placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. And he placed the cup in Pharaoh's hand. But he, Pharaoh, hanged the chief baker, as Joseph had interpreted it to them. Yet the chief butler did not remember Joseph, but forgot him. Dang it. Well, consider firstly the context of the situation. The reason we can probably discern why the butler and baker were thrown into prison in the first place was because being king of the world-ruling superpower at that time, the Egyptian Empire, being along the Nile River and all, being a very fertile land in eastern or northeastern Africa, consider the fact that being king and influence over all these things means you make a lot of enemies. A lot of people are peanut butter and jelly for your crown and would more than likely to opt you to inherit it themselves, including their own children. Now, they'd taken this into consideration and had plenty of military security. But if you can't reach a man through his heart and his sternum, try through his stomach, poison. And considering a likely assassination attempt is what was being talked about in chapter 40 in the earlier verses there. The reason why Pharaoh probably got displeased with the butler and the baker, the one in charge of his drinks and in charge of his food, was an attempted assassination. And since they're CSI Miami or CSI Egypt, Cairo, I suppose, would be the ideal equivalent for us, it wasn't lost on them to do criminal investigation and actually pursue justice. And likely the reason why it took 3 days was not only because of limited technology, they just were able to look at the evidence and say, okay, so this happened then, let's go there and take a look at it. This happened there. Smart people aren't a new contribution to the country. They were Jack Bauers back then too. And all of these things, 48 hours, different reference, but you get the point. The criminal investigation paid off. It turns out that the baker was responsible, and whether he was the one who did the poisoning or they snuck in poison and it was on his watch that he should have been watching the food, he ended up getting executed for it. Level of responsibility with high office. But also for the butler, he was exonerated and restored because he was found to be innocent. But unfortunately with this in the fact that God being given proper credit, just as Joseph interpreted it, Joseph was the first one to say, no, God gave the interpretation, I'm just the voice and vessel. There was a reason also why the butler forgot about Joseph. It wasn't that he was just so wrapped up in the moment that he kind of pulled an ADD moment, brain farted out all of the realities of what should have been, and God had to delay his plans because the butler didn't take his lucidity meds that morning. No, it was basic to the fact that Pharaoh's dream would not be for another 2 years. And since Joseph wouldn't be needed till then, God allowed the butler to space it out, ready, until such a time as needed. We're going to be reading throughout this entire passage that God's timing is the most vital aspect of his plans. As J.R. Tolkien's fictional character Gandalf the Grey is quoted as illustrating, "A wizard is never late, Frodo Baggins, nor is he early. He arrives precisely when he means to." And God functions by the same rule set. So, chapter 41. It came to pass at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream. Go figure. And behold, he stood by the river, and suddenly there came up out of the river 7 cows, fine-looking and fat, and they fed in the meadow. Then behold, 7 other cows came up after them, out of the river, ugly and gaunt, meaning skinny and not really looking like they've been taking their meds. And they stood by the other cows on the bank of the river, and the 7 ugly and gaunt cows ate up the 7 fine-looking and fat cows. And so Pharaoh awoke. He slept and dreamed a second time, and suddenly 7 heads of grain came up on one stalk, plump and good. Then behold, 7 thin heads, blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them, and the 7 thin heads devoured the 7 plump and full heads. So Pharaoh awoke, and indeed it was a dream. Now it came to pass in the morning that his spirit was troubled, and he sent and called for all the magicians of Egypt and all its wise men. These would be his astronomers and his horoscope monitoring details and stuff. It's like, what does it say about me today? Because these dreams, they probably had something to do with it. What do the stars say? But the problem was well, the same thing as horoscopes. The stars in the sky don't tell us anything about our lives in any way whatsoever. His spirit was troubled. He called for them. Pharaoh told them his dreams, but there was no one who could interpret them for Pharaoh. But then, verse 9. Then the chief butler spoke to Pharaoh, saying, I remember my faults this day. I really goofed up here. When Pharaoh was angry with his servants and put me in custody, which I'm not mad about, by the way, in the house of the captain of the guard, both me and the chief baker, we each had a dream in one night, he and I. Each of us dreamed according to the interpretation of his own dream. Now there was a young Hebrew man who was with us there, the servant of the captain of the guard, and we told him, and he interpreted our dreams for us. To each man he interpreted according to his own dream. And it came to pass, just as he has interpreted for us, so it happened. He restored me to my office, and he hanged him. Speaking about Pharaoh. Then Pharaoh sent and called Joseph, and they brought him quickly out of his dungeon, and he shaved, changed his clothing, and came to Pharaoh. So now God's timing is fulfilled, and Joseph is called at the moment that he's needed. Not a moment sooner, not a moment later, exactly when he's needed. But just like these customary introductions, obviously you didn't have ready as much razors as apparently I probably need right now. And to change his clothes, he don't want to be smelly. They didn't have ready showers back then, especially for those in prison. Joseph was to be made looking good on the outside when brought into the presence of the king. But also understand an important detail is, while the king expected an outside good-looking appearance, there was another king, Joseph's king, who expected a lot more on the inside, which is why these 2 years of having to trust God, be patient with God in his timing, not Joseph's, would develop a level of character that we see proven here, and allows him not only to use his gift, but to even be trusted with more. Verse 16 of chapter 41. So Joseph answered Pharaoh. First off, Pharaoh said to Joseph, verse 15, I have had a dream, and there is no one who can interpret it, but I have heard it said of you that you can understand a dream and interpret it. So Joseph answered to Pharaoh, saying, it is not in me. God will give Pharaoh an answer of peace. We see a testament to Joseph's character here. Not only that God was wise in investing such a gift in such a willing and available individual who was ready to use it when God needed it, but also noting the fact that Joseph had the character and the roots to support such fruit growing on the top of the tree. Because if you guys take a look at any lessons, if you take like botany classes in high school, you would know that some of the thickest and largest and most foundational trees are only because it is literally the same picture going on underground. The roots that support you allow you to grow taller above ground, but you need to invest yourself below ground before you start to think, why aren't I being trusted with more things? Why aren't I producing fruit yet? In fact, sometimes even the smallest and most insignificant of plants are actually showing the most kind of progress, because even the smallest bud that comes out of a garden, you would ask any botanist or vineyard dresser this reality that if you're dealing with vegetables or any type of tree or those types of prokaryotic cell-based organisms, to use the largest word possible to give you the illusion of my intelligence, the point is that what's going on underground matters 10 times more than what's happening on top, because if you don't have support inside, you'll be able to produce nothing on the outside, but just eventually a wreck and ruin. A very tall tree with no root is a fallen over log. That's the point. So Joseph is given the opportunity to use his gift, and just like this being preparation and execution from his childhood, we know, recognize, and see that everything that Joseph's been through in his life has been in preparation for this moment. Now, verse 17, Pharaoh said to Joseph, behold, in my dream, now he's going to repeat the dreams again, but I'm going to read it because it includes important details that were left out when it was just first lucidly noted to him. Now, I stood on the bank of the river, and suddenly 7 cows came up out of the river, fine-looking and fat, and they fed on the meadow. And behold, 7 other cows came out of them, poor, very ugly, and gaunt. such ugliness as I have never seen in all the land of Egypt. Now, here's the point. The 7 gaunt and ugly cows came and ate the first 7 fat cows, and when they had eaten them up, note this is a detail that was left out in the previous passage, no one would have known that they had eaten them, for they were just as ugly as at the beginning. So I awoke. So this first dream was the complexity, the skinniness, the starvation that these cows presented, and being all but skin and bones and really not looking good as far as their dietary plan. They eat up these fat-looking cows, but the problem is you would never have been able to tell if they had actually done something for themselves. They ended up looking worse as a result of it. Now, verse 22, I saw also in my dream, suddenly 7 heads came up behind one stalk, full and good. These are heads of grain. And behold, then 7 heads, withered, thin, and blighted by the east wind, sprang up after them. And the thin heads devoured the 7 good heads. So I told this to the magicians, but there was no one who could explain it to me. So Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one. They're the same story. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. The 7 good cows are 7 years, and the 7 good heads are 7 years. The dreams are one. And the 7 thin and ugly cows which came up after them are 7 years, and the 7 emptied and blighted by the east wind are 7 years of famine, in a time where things aren't going to be growing that well. This is the thing which I have spoken to Pharaoh. God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. Indeed, 7 years of great plenty will come throughout all the land of Egypt, but after them 7 years of famine will arise. And all the plenty will be forgotten in all the land of Egypt, and the famine will deplete the land. So the plenty will not be known in the land because of the famine following, for it will be very severe. The dream was repeated to Pharaoh twice because the thing is established by God, and God will shortly bring it to pass. So note, God is given full credit here to allowing not only this time of plenty, but this time of famine. That God is given credit for the good as much as for the bad. But note, while God is offering Pharaoh an opportunity to know in advance that this good time is not going to fully last, but fully learn everything that he could in that good time so he could take full advantage of it, to prepare for a tragedy that will yet come afterwards, that God will use a bad time to test what you were doing in the good. Does that make sense? That by God allowing a tragedy, Pharaoh is given sight in advance to prepare for it. And that if God is going to bring a trial into your life, understand he's given you the instruction manual to not only prepare for it in his word, but also set yourself up for it in your heart. That if you're going to be approaching a bad time, you can't ask God to say, well, God, why don't you just prevent all tragedies from ever happening ever? Because then we'd never learn anything. The point is, when God calls himself Father, he's going to show his attention towards us in that way. He's not a mother who shields her chicks with her body and allows herself to be burned up to protect their lives. Well, God does demonstrate that nature. What God does is says, you fight, you learn, you grow, you walk. I have your back. I'll be there to make sure that you're still standing in the end. So we see this nature of God as the Father happen by not only giving Pharaoh this vision, equipping him for the solution by giving him Joseph as the interpretation, but with all of these things in mind, also prepares Joseph's character to demonstrate this gift beyond just interpretation of dreams, but even more so and more importantly, to give himself management skills, to give him a sound understanding of Egyptian culture and economics during his many a year in Egypt. Note, at the time that the years of famine will actually be over, Joseph will have been a slave for 11 years. It said he was 30 years old when he actually, during this time in his life, he was sold into slavery when he was 18, and he had spent 2 years in prison afterwards. So 13, 17, you get it, adds up to 30. I passed math. I can claim as much about that. But with all these things in mind, understand Joseph had developed other character traits beyond just his interpretation of dreams. God would be able to use what he trusted Joseph with, but also with what he trusted Joseph with, he would prove himself trustworthy by gaining other things on top of it, not wasting the time in between what God would use him for. So, he gives Pharaoh some advice on top of the dreams as a demonstration of his character, his trustworthiness, and his competence as a leader. Now therefore, verse 33, let Pharaoh select a discerning and wise man. No, he doesn't volunteer for the job, but he says, this is what you need. And set him over the land of Egypt. Let Pharaoh do this. Let him appoint officers over the land to collect 1/5, 20% of the produce of the land of Egypt in the 7 plentiful years. I noted the percentage because that'll be important afterwards. Let them gather all the food of the good years that are coming and store the grain under the authority of Pharaoh, and let them keep food in the cities. Then that food shall be as a reserve for the land in the 7 years of famine, which shall be in the land of Egypt, and that the land may not perish during the time of the famine. So we see Joseph demonstrating this gift, and it goes hand in hand actually with the parable that Jesus taught, known as the parable of the talents. Now we say talents like, oh, can you juggle? Can you ride a unicycle? Can you juggle while riding a unicycle? It's those kind of gifts and talents. Are you double jointed? That kind of deal. A talent was actually, ironically enough, comparative to both, were an illustration, but a talent was a measure of money back in those days, so very considerable sum at that. They measured a day's wage by a penny. It was called a denarius, and if you had a great number of denariuses, or denarii, I guess is the way you pronounce it, you would be entrusted with a talent, and if you had a number of talents, you'd be given other measurements and weights. You know, it's not healthy for your wallet's slim figure to carry $20 bills when you can just have 120. It's that kind of philosophy. Jesus talked about this parable of God entrusting spiritual gifts, and specifically entrusting the gospel to people. Some he gave 1 opportunity, some he gave 3 opportunities, some of them he gave 5, and it was what they did with what they were given that ultimately accounts for what they were standing up for in the end. That's the account in Matthew. But in Luke, he repeats this parable, but with a little different of a spin on it. It's referring to spiritual gifts and our reward in heaven. That what God's entrusted us with from the get-go varies. I mean, you could be born into a good home, you could be established with all of these good looks and all of these influences and connections, or you could just be given the desire to do it, and the competence and desire and drive to be able to pursue these goals, and may end up in exactly the same place as the person who was given more from the start. And it's basically the same philosophy. Our goal is a home run. Whether you start on first base or you start on third base, the goal is to get, even if you have a larger journey to go. And God has entrusted some with much, some with a little. And the person who was entrusted with a lot doubled his money. He was given 5, he gained 10. And Jesus said, I'll give you charge over 10 cities. And then for another it was 3, and he gained 6, and he said, I'll entrust you over 6. Because it's not what we have, it's what we finish with. It's not how we started, but again. Then there was one who didn't use his gift, and it ended up being wasted, and Jesus took his talent and gave it to the person who had 10, because, let's be honest, a wasted life, it can't be rewarded for it. Even if you have the potential but never use it, what's the point? All these things being put in mind, it's how you invest your skills and talents that function just like money compounding interest. It's worth that much more to the Father, not only with what you start with, but what you finish and what you do with it that ultimately results in how much that was worth to you. And in Luke chapter 16 and verse 10, Jesus puts a capstone on this logic by saying, he who is faithful in what is least, the little things, is faithful also in much. Character doesn't change, responsibilities may. So what needs to be invested in more? He who is unjust in what is least is also unjust in much. Corruption doesn't change based off of if you have more or have less. And it goes hand in hand with the questions some people ask, like, why don't we have children? If you're a married couple and you have to ask yourself, well, what are you doing with what you already have? How are you treating your wife? Would that be a good reflection on how you'll one day be treating kids? Maybe if you're in a dating relationship, but you're asking, why aren't I married yet? Well, how are you treating your family? The relationships you already are bonded into. What has God trusted you with? What are you doing with what you have, not with what you want? And probably the most direct answer for relationships is, why aren't I in one? I want to date. I want to spoil the girl or the guy, and I just want to be that loving, supportive. I'll do all of these things, but it's just, God, why don't you let me have a relationship? how are you treating your relationship with him? If God doesn't come first, why would a man change that? Why would a woman change that? Recognize, you've been entrusted with what you need, and what you want should give you a greater drive to develop your character to support it. Levi Lesko actually put it well in his study on the Song of Solomon. Don't look for the one, become the one, and let them find you. So, that being pointed out, ask yourself a question. How was Joseph as a slave? How was Joseph as a prisoner? How was Joseph when he was appointed king? Second in command, in fact, over all of Egypt. It's the same answer. Character doesn't change. God's timing. It's how you prepare for it. That's what matters. So, I will continue. The advice, verse 37, and I'll continue on to verse 45, was good in the eyes of Pharaoh and all the eyes of his servants. And Pharaoh said to his servants, can we find such a one as this man in whom is the Spirit of God? That's a good thing for a leader to surround himself with people who fear the Lord. Even if it's not the majority, it's one person that can make the difference. One light in a room certainly shines out the dark. Then Pharaoh said to Joseph, inasmuch as God has shown you all this, there is none as discerning and as wise as you. You shall be over my house, and all my people shall be ruled according to your word. Only in regarding to the throne, only in title shall I be greater than you. And Pharaoh said to Joseph, see, I have set before you all the land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh took his signet ring. It would be the measure of authority. If they were to sign a legal law or decree, they would take a dollop of wax and stamp the signet, and they would know by the mark that was left in it that it was from the office of the king or the captain of the guard or such and such. And he clothed him with he put it on Joseph's hand. He clothed him in garments of fine linen, put a gold chain around his neck, symbol of authority, and he had him ride in the second chariot which he had, Air Force Dos, as Levi put it. And they cried out before him, bow the knee. So he set him over all the land of Egypt. Pharaoh also said to Joseph, I am Pharaoh, and without your consent no man may lift his hand or foot in all the land of Egypt. And Pharaoh called Joseph's name Zaphnath-Paneah, which is an Egyptian King Tut style name that probably means God speaks and he lives, which is a good testimony to his character, and it would also come in handy later so that a certain individual wouldn't recognize him because they were calling him by another name. And he also has his wife for him, Asenath, which was the daughter of Potiphar, not Potiphar, but another guy who was the priest of On, an Egyptian deity. So Joseph went out over all the land of Egypt. So all of these things in mind, Joseph is blessed abundantly. And it says he was 30 years old, verse 46, when he stood before the Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. And Joseph went out from the presence of Pharaoh and went throughout all the land of Egypt. Now the 7 plentiful years of the ground brought forth abundantly. So ready? He gathered up all the food of the 7 years which were in the land of Egypt and laid up the food in the cities. In every city, the food of the fields which surrounded them. Ready? Joseph gathered very much grain as the sand of the sea until he stopped counting, for it was immeasurable. So God had equipped them to get through what was coming next. That's the important point that needs to be made. God doesn't allow tragedies to happen without giving us fair warning. And during that time of fair warning, if we waste that time, it's only up to us to look back and recognize, oh, see the point? Verse 50, and also to Joseph were born 2 sons before the years of the famine came, whom Asenath, the daughter of Potiphar, priest of On, bore to him. Joseph called the name of the firstborn Manasseh, which means forgetfulness, and the reason why was, for God has made me forget all the toil of and all my father's house. So everything that he had gone up into in this point, it didn't matter to him. And whenever he called his son Manasseh, it'd say, hey, forgetfulness, come over here. And he's like, who are you? No, joke. And to the second, verse 52, the name of the second he called Ephraim, which means fruitfulness. For God has caused me to be fruitful in the land of my affliction. Then the 7 years of plenty which were in the land of Egypt ended, and the 7 years of famine began to come. And as Joseph had said, the famine was in all lands, but in all the land of Egypt there was bread. So when all the land of Egypt was famished, the people cried to Pharaoh for bread. Then Pharaoh said to all the Egyptians, "Go to Joseph, whatever he says to you, do." The famine was over all the face of the earth. Ready? And Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians. And the famine became severe in the land of Egypt. So all countries came to Joseph in Egypt to buy grain, because the famine was severe in all lands. Joseph is blessed for yet another opportunity, a major one at that, for saving lives. But also understand, what was the witness that Joseph gave as far as how he represented God and his character? Also consider the fact that the level of influence Joseph had would by no means keep him silent as to the type of God, or the God of which he did serve. There would still be pagans. There would still be those who disagreed. But understand, a lot of people look back and say, why does the New Testament God seem like he wants to save everybody, but the Old Testament God says, no, Israel only, meh. In the book of Daniel, Daniel sees the legacy in life of three, well actually more than that, but the major ruling kings of the world during the time of Nebuchadnezzar all the way to King Cyrus, who would then be preceded by Artaxerxes, who would fulfill the decree under which you guys can read in the book of Nehemiah, which we'll be getting to eventually. During that time, Daniel was given the opportunity, in Daniel chapter 4, to give Nebuchadnezzar a divine warning. Several, in fact, that pointed out to him who the true and living God was. Remember the fiery furnace and the incident with the three Hebrew children whose names were Azariah, Mishael, and Hananiah, whom they renamed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And Daniel was also renamed Belshazzar. Translation of cultures, we'll get into it when we discuss Daniel. But Nebuchadnezzar got to see God deliver the children of Israel from the fire after immediately killing two of his guard with his furnace. So proving that it should have killed them, but it didn't. Nebuchadnezzar got to see a miracle in regards to how these men were prepared in Daniel chapter 1. Nebuchadnezzar literally went insane because of pride, and God struck him as such after giving him a vision and warning him and equipping him and saying, look, how you've been viewing your kingship and how you've been viewing God have been very contradictory as far as the facts, and God is going to judge you for it if you continue. Daniel warned him. He didn't obey. After a year, he fell to pride and ended up thinking he was an animal, for it says 7 seasons. The word could mean years, or it could mean it was like a year and 3/4, because, winter, spring, summer, fall, so on and so forth, 7 seasons. So a year, 4 seasons, and then next fall, I guess. Regardless of what the terms we're talking about, understand the importance of these points. Nebuchadnezzar, at the end of all of this, declared there is no God to be worshipped but the true and living God. The same is true for Darius, for Cyrus, for all of the individuals who got to see and witness all of these things. Now, do you honestly think that if a king came to a relationship with the true and living God, that every single city would hear about who the God really was? Egypt was not only a world-ruling power at this time, but for all intents and purposes became a Christian nation. There were still pagans there, granted. There was still that innate culture because it was run by people who pursued their own ends, means, and desires and had their own stories, opinions, and traditions. That was allowed. But just like with the United States of America, understand the reason why we're called a Christian nation isn't because our history reflects it. It's because Christians founded it, because Christians inhabit it. And as Jesus said, we're the salt of the earth, meant to preserve flavor and keep bacteria at bay, to be the light of the world and keep darkness out simply by us holding up as a lampstand God's light. This is just one example of many in Scripture of how God focused on saving a king and let the king continue to be an influence over an entire nation and eventually the entire world to receive the gospel at the same time, to know who God really was and to look forward and into his promises, his legacy for the children of Israel, the exact same way that they were saved by trusting that God was true in his promises. But also noting that Joseph sees the fruition of all of these things. What's his point? Well, we see that preparation is oftentimes not an easy ordeal. In fact, it usually means a trial, a testing. Just like getting stronger means that after you work out, you're going to feel weak before your muscles begin to grow. If we can't see our future, and we're oftentimes discouraged by our past, understand and remember who is with you in the present. That's what we can learn from the life and legacy of Joseph, that faith means trusting God. And trusting someone counts the most when it makes the least sense, when it's not easy. Any of us have played a number of video games or watched a number of series that sometimes the greatest payoff in a story or the greatest achievement in a game is the one that was the hardest to reach. But also understand all countries were coming to Joseph for grain and bread. That also includes his family. We will get into Joseph's reunion with his brothers in the next study. I want to thank you for your time in listening to this one. If you have questions about the topics discussed, or perhaps how to have a more fruitful, more Ephraim-based relationship with your walk with God, leave them in the comments below. I always meet sincerity with eagerness. If you would like to encourage the ministry, leave a like and subscribe for more in the future. We've got a long way to go in the scripture, so you can trust that these studies will keep going. But most importantly, if you know someone who's perhaps going through a time of famine in the wilderness, or maybe is going through a time of plenty, but doesn't know what's happening next. The life is good, but the next life is not so well prepared for. Please share this study with anyone and everyone you feel would be blessed by it and needs to hear it, because understand, we have been given so much in this life. But it ultimately comes down to how we prepare for the next one as to determine whether or not that time will destroy us, or the one thing that we've done to prepare ourselves for it in this life will ultimately result in leading to prosperity in the second, and that comes only through the name of Jesus. And in his name, and for his sake, and by his word, I thank you for your time, and remember that he wants to bless you. All you need to do is receive it.